Let's dive straight into the biggest issue right now. Hands down, the Bryce Cotton situation is the biggest one that we've got during free agency, not only for the Wildcats, but because there'll be some teams who would love to try and get a bid together to get Bryce Cotton, but then there'll be other teams watching that situation to work out what they're going to do.
Yeah, so let's frame it from where the talks began, right? It was earlier in the season where Bryce Cotton met with Mark Arena, the owner, Danny Mills, the GM, and they put an offer on the table to Bryce and his management. No offer was accepted. And so this is why this has dragged out for so long. And it's been the big question throughout the entire season of, is this Bryce's last season in the NBL or with the Perth Wildcats? Now, as it stands right now, I think we all have our opinion on what we think will happen. No one knows for sure. As it stands right now, my feel is that we more than likely will not see Bryce Cotton back in the league next season. That's what it feels like. Obviously, the money in Japan is something that is very substantial. We've spoken about Trevor Gleeson as the head coach of the Chiba Jets. All of those things coming together makes us feel like Bryce Cotton more than likely won't be back. I will never say never, right? He is based in Perth. He lives in Perth. But it feels like the money elsewhere and the opportunity elsewhere might be too much for him to turn down.
It seems like that might be the case. And again, we look at what Bryce Cotton's achieved and what he's worth right now, and that makes sense. And a lot of people will sit there, even Perth fans understanding, if you're worth this amount and you're getting offered this amount, of course you have to go and take that if it's in Japan. We know the Perth Wildcats went to Japan in the pre-season.
The worst decision they could ever have.
which is interesting. You kind of put him on a silver platter.
Why are you going to Japan?
Put him there and just say, hey.
Would you like to have a look at this?
Exactly.
So that's interesting. And again, we've talked about this ever since we've started talking about him being a free agent and teams circling just to see what happens, all right? Teams who would be getting together with the ownership, with management thinking, do we have enough to have a bid for him if he becomes a free agent? Because when this happened, this was 3 months ago, we all thought, okay, the extension's been offered, he hasn't signed it. There's still been the potential that he could have signed in this last 3 months, which then teams would have gone the other way. They're still monitoring to see what happens. And as Olgun alluded to, it looks like it's going down the path of not being the case. So teams that we know have thought about, okay, do we have enough money? Do we put all our eggs in this basket? It's going to be a fascinating watch.
Well, it raises a question of, what can the league do from a macro perspective to ensure we don't lose players of Bryce's caliber? Because this is an all-time great who we may not be able to see fulfill and show the longevity in his NBL career. I joked with Andrew Gaze the other day that we may need to rename the MVP trophy. But Bryce is going to get his 5th trophy. He's still well in his prime. He could rack up 7 or 8 MVPs if he was able to stay here. Now you talk about not only an NBL legend, but you talk about an all-time great in Australian sport.
Well, this is the question. It's easy for us to say because I don't think any of us are on that sort of money. So the money is one thing, but then the legacy is the other. How big of a factor do we think this could be?
I spoke about the legacy, I guess, in the last few weeks since it's all been brought up and you're talking about the money side of it. But Bryce got a great point. And this is a guy who was in Huddle last year when he sat down. He said he's got things on his mirror that he's continuing to cross off, but he doesn't want to tell anybody else what it is. But he adds another MVP to his list now, 5. It probably should already be 6. And then what he could potentially achieve. You know he wants to win championships too, so that adds to it. But for the longest time, we thought that everything that Gaze achieved would never be close to anyone getting close to that kind of trophy cabinet. But at the age that he is, what he's producing this year, to be able to continue to do that, if we revisited this in 3 years' time, it could be a staggering conversation.
Pete, there's an argument to be made that this is his greatest season. And if that's the case, well, you would figure his decline is going to happen over the next 6 to 7 years. And even if he was 10% less of what he's done this season, he's still probably the MVP. And I don't know what Perth do to ensure that he stays there. Is there any else that they can provide him, Olgun, other than money to help their case?
There was a clear sticking point in the process of the Perth Wildcats this season, and it was re-signing John Riley to that 3-year deal. Right around that point, the whispers began to grow even louder that it maybe Bryce might go and look elsewhere. Again, we've spoken, I think, ad nauseum about the fact that his relationship with John Riley is purely professional, and that's totally fine. But if you're Bryce Cotton and JR is there on a 3-year deal, I think we then maybe understate the amount of money that exists in Japan. It is an amount of money that is life-changing for a young family like what Bryce has. The other thing that's worth noting is the comments that Mark Arena made to the media shortly after it began to trickle out that we're keeping an eye on Bryce Cotton's contract situation, where he projected the idea that, all right, we're going to pay Bryce the most amount of money that anyone's ever been offered. From what I understand, I don't think that sat well with Bryce. The fact that that was what was being projected to the media and to the public. So all of that matters. I wouldn't say that money is like the driving factor for Bryce Cotton. I'd say it's not a non-factor though. And again, for someone with a young family, I imagine getting that amount of money from, let's say, Japan is enough of an inducement to go there, as opposed to fulfilling a legacy, which seems pretty locked up already.
So are the two options Perth or Asian money, or is there a chance that another NBL team could come here with a knockout blow?
I wouldn't completely rule out another NBL team. I say that the options are limited. From what I understand, there are only certain coaches who Bryce would want to play for.
Sure.
He's in that really privileged opportunity where he can basically pick where he goes. And that's a really cool place to be in. And so out of the teams that I think have a coach that Bryce, I think, would appreciate playing for and would have the opportunity, Melbourne's probably the only one that has an opening. And that all comes down to what Matthew Dellavedova does as well. I think Bryce has an appreciation and respect for someone like Dean Vickham and someone like Scott Roth as well. Whether Tasmania can front up that sort of money is a different question. And then it's up to those teams. We've seen the Perth Wildcats over the past few seasons. They're hitting almost that $4 million mark in their cash spend. That's a really, really high number. Mm. And you almost have to do that with Bryce Cotton because of how much money you're paying him and the fact that there are no things within the cap system that you can do to marquee that number. You have to pay that entire thing on the cap. There are no mechanisms to lower that on your cap hit. And so you know that when you're buying into Bryce Cotton, you're buying into a substantial cash spend and a substantial luxury tax.
Pete, let me just say one thing. And you're a romantic, you're an idealist like me with basketball. I would hate to see Bryce in the NBL, but not in a Perth uniform.
It'd be weird. It'd be really weird, wouldn't it? Because we've just known him as a Perth Wildcats legend. The one thing on all of the Bryce conversations, I've been very impressed with the way he's gone about it this season.
Agree.
When you are the biggest name we've had in a very long time and it's constantly there week in and week out, and he's just been professional saying, I'm dealing with that at the end of the season because I just want to focus on winning, which we know he does, winning. And as you said, probably having his best season to date. So be able to do that and rise above it. Whatever comes next, if it's Japan, if it's another team, it's been a privilege to be able to sit back and watch what he's done, and he's well-deserving whatever it is. Selfishly, we all want him here in the NBL, but whatever it is, it's going to be completely well-deserved, and it's going to be a big one to watch.
I'll make it clear that it's unlikely that he's in another NBL jersey. The safe money is on him if he's not with the Perth Wildcats, that he's somewhere overseas.
I feel like the Red Army would vomit if they saw Bryce Cotton wearing a Melbourne United jersey, to be honest, but you never know. We mentioned that he's the biggest name, and as Olgun and the boys explain here, not just because of what it means for Perth, but what it means for other teams as well.